Make sure you're back home by 8 o'clock sharp. With the words of his strict Presbyterian father still ringing in his ears, his cricket gear under one long arm, Bendy Henderson wheeled his bone shaker up his drive to join Stumpy Sanderson and me, who sat outside his gate on our rally tomahawks. It was the start of the works holidays, and in the early Friday evening warmth, most of our road was full of the salt and vinegar sizzle of gurnet and chips, and the hustle and bustle of activity, as those families who were lucky enough to be going away busied themselves loading their Vauxhall Victors and Vivas, ready for the following morning's departure to such climes as Walton on the Naze, Weston-super-Mare, and Weymouth. The exotic exceptions to this planned exodus were Mr. and Mrs. Appleby, who lived next door but one to Bendy in the large house that stood next to the park gate. They were an unusual couple. Mr. Appleby with his man John Collier safari jacket, brill-creamed hair and waxed cad's moustache, and Mrs. Appleby with her enormous beehive, sunglasses as large as Saturn, and a make-up-pasted face that resembled a collapsed souffle. A couple whose annual holiday slideshows to the lucky or unlucky few revealed that they enjoyed the naturist style of holidaying around certain European resorts, and who had, according to Bendy, been witnessed on more than one occasion from behind the Hendersons' curtains, sunbathing amidst their gladioli in just such a distinct lack of attire. As we slowly cycled past their gate, we watched them load cans of Mrs. Appleby's hair lacquer into their gilded caravan, and we admired Mr. Appleby's pale blue and cream sunbeam rapier car, which would soon be pulling their floating passion wagon halfway across the continent. For this year, everyone along our road knew that the Applebys were heading somewhere even more glamorous than usual. This year, they were heading for Italy, driving through France first, and we also knew that Mr. Appleby intended to beat his time record for driving non-stop to Dover to catch the ferry. The Applebys smiled and gave us cheerful waves and carried on with their weird ways, whilst we headed into the park, setting up our cricket stumps about 120 yards or so from the park gate and about 10 yards in front of the rough wire mesh fence which protected the pebble-dashed backs of the parallel houses. I batted first, and batted poorly, but Stumpy gave a batting display of dogged defiance. Thus, it was not until just before 7:15 that Bendy eventually got his turn to bat. Adopting his trademark beanpole stance, I squinted behind milk bottle glasses, goofy teeth protruding in intense concentration. Shining the ball and taking his usual miler's run-up, Stumpy's first two balls were wild, wayward and wide. But the third ball hurtled up through the air without bouncing until it reached Bendy's full head height. But instead of ducking, Bendy gracefully pirouetted, swinging his bat and hooking the ball hard and high over his left shoulder, straight over the wire fence and headed straight towards a frosted back bathroom window in one of the houses behind. The ball travelled through the air at a tremendous pace, hurtling like a leather comet, but thankfully at the last moment, its flight path lowered, the ball missed the window and with a loud thud hit the wall of the house, rebounded and disappeared into a large tree that stood in the garden. We waited for that ball to drop, and waited some more, and then realised that it was somehow stuck in the foliage. Now, even though we knew that at some point that ball would need retrieving somehow, we performed a little dance of relief and euphoria over the fact that we had not actually broken the bathroom window. However, this mood was soon tempered by a horrible and ghastly realisation that was bone-chillingly articulated by Stumpy. "Do you realise whose house that is? Old Man Macready's." Deathly silence. Old Man Macready, the wild man of Liscombe Road, Renowned bare-knuckle brawler with a face like a gravel drive, arms like tree trunks, and a Charles Atlas torso tattooed with a snarling tangerine tiger. Being the boy who had smote that fateful stroke, and being a boy of honour, Bendy knew that it was his dreaded duty to recover the ball, and his face had by now gone a strange off-white to reflect this fact. While Stumpy and I strained and pulled at the bottom of the rough wire mesh fence to create enough room for him, he wriggled milk snake-like underneath it into Macready's garden, which was as quiet as a cemetery. Ducking as low as he could, Bendy scooted to the tree, shinning expertly up it and disappearing into its dense leafage. Eventually, his head emerged, like some huge dandelion, a long arm raised in triumph, holding aloft the cricket ball. What happened next was inexplicable. For instead of climbing back down the tree, for reasons known only to himself, Bendy tried to hurl the ball back to Stumpy and me. But as he swung his arm back, he lost his grip, and the ball flew out of the back of his hand and, with a sound like a gunshot, went straight into the bathroom window behind him, leaving a huge crack down its centre. Bendy swung round, and time froze. After long moments, the window opened, and standing there was the bare-chested figure and shaving-foamed face of Macready, Mexican bandit moustache bristling, drunken red eyes flaming like a wolfhound. Faced with such a fearsome sight, Bendy made what he considered to be the most appropriate gestures in the circumstances. He gave a gormless smile and a little wave. In less than the time it took for a Polaris nuclear missile to launch, Macready had hurtled downstairs and was charging murderously up the garden in his hobnail boots and Brutus jeans. But in this time, Bendy had slid down the tree faster than a ferret down a trouser leg and was already halfway back under the fence, which Stumpy and I were frantically pulling up for him. Macready gave a huge roar, leaping at the fence and vaulting up it like some great foaming beast. As we got on our bikes, having frenziedly gathered up our cricket gear, Stumpy shouted "Scarper!" and we began pedalling like maniacs. However, trying to pedal from a standing start on grass is difficult, and for a few agonising moments it seemed as if we were doomed, for as Macready dropped over the fence onto our side of the park, we were only some 15 yards or so from him. But being pursued by such a clomping brute with an ugly purpose is a wonderful incentive, and with Stumpy's little legs whirling like a dervish, me pedalling harder than I'd ever pedalled before, and with Bendy's long legs at last getting into their full rhythm, his neck straining like a Galapagos tortoise, we began to put in some hard pedalling and created distance between ourselves and Macready. With the safety of the park gate now approaching, Bendy turned round, slowed down, and, laughing at the receding progress of Macready, gave him a rude gesture. Stumpy and I went through the park gate together, hit the hard surface of the pavement, and then pedalled the necessary yards to safety, laughing and grinning at each other, until we realised Bendy was not with us. We later learned that one of the dangers of Bendy pedalling so hard on his bone shaker bicycle was the propensity for his flared trousers to get stuck in the chain. And that is precisely what had happened, causing him to slip off his saddle and come to a juddering halt, still some 20 yards or so from the park gate. Seeing this calamity had given Macready a new lease of life, and, building up a fresh head of steam, he had charged with all the ferociousness of a wild boar. Just in time, the snared Bendy managed to tear his trouser leg free and, leaving his bike where it was on the ground, he ran pell-mell for the gate. Stumpy and I now saw Bendy hurtle through the gate and, panic-stricken, jump straight over the Appleby's front stone wall. Like some desperate and cornered prey, with the safety of his own front door agonisingly out of reach, he sought some bolt hole, dashed up the side of the Appleby's caravan, tried its door, opened it, dived into its sanctuary, and shut the door behind him. Seconds later, we saw Macready come hopping and steaming through the gate to see no Bendy, who had vanished like a puff of smoke. Macready stood and took in the situation, sniffing the air, flexing his murderous hands. His face rippled and rutted. He looked down the road at Stumpy and me for long minutes, and during that time it felt as if we were looking into the depths of hell itself. With a final defiant shake of his fist, Macready then turned and went back the way he had come. Stumpy and I both breathed huge sighs of relief. We waited for a few more minutes, and then slowly began to pedal back to tell Bendy that the coast was now clear. Suddenly, we heard a door open and slam. We heard laughter and happy voices. We saw the towering blonde skyscraper of Mrs. Appleby's beehive and Mr. Appleby's slick salesman features leave their house, walk up the side of their caravan, lock its door, and then jump into Mr. Appleby's gleaming pale blue and cream sunbeam rapier car, which Mr. Appleby gunned into life first time. Horrified, Stumpy and I stared at each other and once again began pedalling like maniacs, shouting and waving. But as the Applebys turned out into the road, they mistook our gestures for bon voyages and simply waved back at us. As the car and caravan began to pull away, now seared across our consciousness was their destination, Italy, through France first, non-stop to Dover to catch the ferry. At that very moment, the Hendersons' front door opened, and Bendy's strict Presbyterian father loomed tall on the doorstep, looking at his watch and scouring the street for the by now late Bendy. As the caravan began to recede into the distance, at its back window appeared the horrified face of Bendy, and all Stumpy and I could do was stop and wave in respectful homage to where he was heading now. Au revoir, Bendy. Arrivederci, Bendy. Goodbye, Bendy Henderson.